Good morning. I'm Paul Jenkins, University Librarian at Franklin Pierce University. Welcome to the latest in our presentation of speakers sponsored by the IDEAL Initiative. IDEAL stands for Initiative for Digital Education for Accelerated Learning. In May 2018, the university was granted funds from the Davis Foundation in order to transform current undergraduate pedagogical practice at Pierce through the enhancement across the curriculum of digital skills and literacy. Our guest this morning is Pat Irwin-Plug. She holds an MLIS in Library and Information Science from Indiana University and an MS in Internet Strategies Management with a focus on organizational learning from Marlborough College. And I just learned this morning that she teaches a course whose title is intriguing to me, Digital Democracy. Today, Pat will speak to us about open educational resources, better known as OER. Please join me in welcoming Pat to Franklin Pierce.
Thank you. Wow, it's bright. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been involved in the OER movement for about 6 years, and it's something that's very, very dear to my heart. So what we're going to do, could I have the next slide, please, is talk today about a few working definitions, because OER, there's a lot of controversy around what is really an OER. Why OER is so important. Some current and common faculty concerns. We have to at least mention copyright. How I have been thinking about how we address faculty concerns. Then I want to look at a few of the major OER repositories and maybe some that don't always rise to the surface. My intention is to do this all in about 45 minutes, so there's an opportunity for questions. Next slide, please. When we talk about open educational resources, what we're talking about are those items that are freely accessible, openly licensed. They are under copyright. It's just that the owner of the OER has granted us all certain rights and privileges to use the OER, or they're under public domain. And they can be in any format. Paper, for instance. We still talk about paper. They're free to the student. One of the things that I've been kind of pushing at both my institution and to groups that I talk to is that your library resources are a wonderful source of not exactly OER, but they're free to the student because they've already paid their tuition for them. Open washing. This is when a publisher kind of presents the information like it might be OER, but they're still going to have some proprietary practices. They either make the student pay to access the information or access the supplemental information. This is becoming more and more prevalent as publishers are beginning to understand that OER is a real threat to the standard publishing model. And then I'm not going to talk much about open pedagogy. I understand you've already had some conversations about it. Certainly they use OER and invite students to participate in the development of OER. But at its heart, it's really good teaching as we look more and more at open pedagogy. And I can give you an example from my digital democracy class. We do 3 units on citizen journalism. And we start out by looking at 18th century newspapers, actually, and some of the ways slander was used. They said horrible things about politicians in the older newspapers. We then look at journalism standards and ethics. And then finally, I asked them to actually go out and participate as a citizen journalist. And over the years, I've learned I have to be really, really careful about what they need to cover. No accidents, no children. I usually teach the course in the winter, and that unit kind of hits town meeting. So my students are mostly adults. the number of them who have never attended a town meeting is astonishing to me. They go to a town meeting or they go to a school board meeting and they report back, and then they reflect on the experience. And over the years, that's become one of both their favorite assignments and my favorite assignments. Okay, next slide, please. So why is OER important? If you believe that literacy around the world is important, then OER is a natural fit. And OER did not start in the United States. It started in Europe. It started in the African countries as a way to bring current and quality information to those students that might not have access to standard library resources. Lowering the cost of higher education. I think we've all heard that. And textbook costs have risen over the last 10 years, far higher than healthcare, housing, and food. They're just kind of out of sight. So it's a way of providing course materials for free or low cost. Leveling the playing field. Students who struggle financially, we know 52% of them report that they don't buy the textbook. They try to do the course without the textbook. So this is a way of bridging that gap. There are all sorts of studies too, and I give you in the handout reference to the most recent Babson study on this, that students who have access to OER do better in classes, which makes sense if you're not buying the textbooks and trying to do the class, if you suddenly have access to the resources. They take more classes, and that's been a really interesting bit of research done on that. They don't buy beer. They don't buy unnecessary items. What they're doing, if they're not taking classes, they're spending their money on food and rent or childcare. So OER has that impact. And finally, it presents an opportunity for the faculty. Creating materials that you can customize for your class. You can engage in open pedagogy, but you still maintain control over your own work through putting a Creative Commons license on your work. And I'm not familiar enough with the faculty at Franklin Pierce to know what your contracts say with regards to what you own and what you don't. But at Granite State College, when I'm an adjunct, and when I sign my contract, it says the college owns everything I create. And I've worked hard to try to get that changed. I haven't gotten anywhere. But if you can maintain control over your own resources that you create, that's a benefit to you. Next slide, please. So what are the concerns? And at some point I'll ask you all what concerns you have, but these are the ones that kind of rise to the top most frequently. Most faculty that I've talked to are concerned about the cost of higher education, the cost of textbooks. At the same time, 56% of the faculty surveyed have never heard of OER. So there's this huge body out there. They're concerned about quality. And I think that this one is an interesting one because if you think about how you select resources for your classes anyway, you're thinking about quality. You have a standard. You look at how current the information is, who's presenting it. In the handout, I've given you some links to quality OER rubrics, things that you can use. They're basically the same set of standards that you go through when you pick any kind of materials for your course. These are all digital format. I like paper. Some are in paper, but more frequently now, you're not the only ones who like paper. students like paper too. And some of the places that I'm going to send you to look at open textbooks have printing capabilities. And you can set it up on campus for a minimal cost, or the student can pay at a very minimal cost to get the textbook printed out. Hard to find, not all disciplines covered, and hard to use. It is getting easier, but this is perhaps the most legitimate one, that you can spend hours looking for OER that exactly meet your needs for your course. Too much time to create. This is another very legitimate one. If you're moving from a textbook that you buy commercially to a press book that you're creating, there's a tremendous amount of time involved in creating it. And at some point, I'm going to show you some alternatives to doing that. Tenure concerns. This is one that's changing, but textbooks in general rarely count for tenure anyway. But OER seems to have hit a bump with tenure, and most recently I was at Dartmouth, and I know that this was coming up again and again as an issue. Next slide, please. So what about copyright? Copyright limits how you can use a resource. OER are under copyright, and the copyright is usually owned by the faculty member who creates the OER. But if you use a Creative Commons license, you determine what anyone else can do with that. And it can be as restrictive as all you want is it attributed to you, the original work, to I don't want it used for commercial purposes, I don't want it changed. Pretty much that's the end result. But I wanted to make sure that you knew that they are under copyright, except for public domain resources. And you know, the whole issue of public domain, if you're looking at public domain resources that you want to use, you want to do something with them, I check with your library. And because public domain can be a pretty complex issue. Walt Disney knows all about this with Mickey Mouse, who is supposed to fall out of copyright this year, and they keep pushing it back. So if you use Mickey Mouse, you're in trouble. I found it on the web. It's free to use. Be careful here. Our copyright laws are very different from international law or other countries' law, and when in doubt, ask. And I can give you a good example of this with a business course. There's a university in Pakistan that's doing a wonderful job of digitizing Pearson textbooks in business, and then making the digital copy available. And one of our business faculty said, wow, this is great. And he put a link in the bookstore to the students. It didn't last very long, but it was long enough for some students to say, hey, look, there was this free version. Now I have to pay $58 for it. And it created a kind of a tense situation for everybody. So just be aware when you're out there, if you have any questions, it's probably not really an OER. So what can you do? Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, but this is not going to, you're not going to be able to see much of this. This is something I've been working on for a number of years. It starts out with a commercial textbook and all the things you can do with it and things you can't do with it. It goes down to the library, and I can give you a copy of this, where we talk a little bit about what you can do with library resources. The third and the next ones are a little more useful for you. Open textbooks. I'm going to give you some repositories to look at. You could take that textbook right from the repository And as long as you follow the Creative Commons license, you can pretty much do whatever the Creative Commons license says you can do with it, including change it, put it in a different format, add your own study questions to it. And then finally down here, and I'm not going to go through this deeply because it's not showing up very well, is actually writing your own press book, where you're writing big sections of it and taking pieces from other places. And that's by far the most labor intensive and requires a certain commitment from the institution, because you're going to need proofreaders, I'll assume. You're going to need probably someone checking on copyright on all the pieces and kind of helping you with the process. Something we don't have but at Granite State, or we didn't have, and we moved right to press books. And after 2 years, learned a whole lot about why this was not a good idea to do it this way. Next slide, please. Okay. Major OER repositories: searchable, faculty-reviewed, and in broad subjects. Open Textbook Network, OpenStax, and BC Campus. BC Campus is in Canada, and they're really in the forefront of OER. They're doing a tremendous amount of work, not with both creating resources, but also working with faculty and teaching them about them. OER repositories. OER Commons, searchable, reviewed, K through 12 resources in college level. So if you're teaching any kind of education classes, OER Commons is a wonderful place to go. HathiTrust Digital Library, another place, wonderful resources. And then Digital Commons Network, which actually is not, it's a for-profit company, but they're making available a lot of institutional repositories. And that's really the last place I was going to mention. Institutional repositories are springing up all over. You as a faculty member write a paper, you deposit a copy, pre-publication. Generally, they're open to the public. And they're usually part of the library's scholarly publications efforts. Unfortunately, the organization search tools, it depends on the institution. You can spend a lot of time in the institutional repositories. Next slide, please. Hidden OER. These are things you may not have considered. The American Memory Project from the Library of Congress. Large public libraries, New York Public being one of them, they're putting up huge digital collections for you to use. Library research guides. These are things librarians are producing all over the country, and they can be a wealth of information about leading you to other OER. And then finally, the Gray Literature Network. These are research reports, data, lab notebooks. It's international, and it's just a wealth of information that's out there. And I think it's probably the most untapped resource going at this point. Okay, so what kinds of questions? This is really a racing tour through OER, but what kind of questions do you have?
Sorry, I would ask you that you raise your hand, and I'll give you the mic so that this is being videotaped so people can hear it easily. So, yeah, so one thing I'll mention right off the bat is even though OER is very difficult, some places are doing this. Keene State's biology department has made the commitment to go fully OER, so someplace very close to us. I think Pat did a really good job of looking at some of the difficulties that OER creates, but they're not insurmountable. So anyway, questions?
Yeah, you have one here.
What do you recommend as far as professional development opportunities to learn more about OER? I mean, conferences, colloquiums, things that you've attended that have been very useful?
Um, Probably the best thing that I did was 2 summers ago, I was an OER fellow for Open OER Commons, and that led to a project to develop faculty training modules on OER, and those are they're free. Yeah, they are. And they really kind of gently walk you through the process. It's also Canadian. So when you get to copyright, you have to move over to the United States to do it. But that's one of the best ones. There's the Open Education conference every year. And I've been disappointed in it. It's not been, there's little factions that go through. The other thing is Creative Commons provides training sessions for faculty that are just for faculty on Creative Commons licensing. And it's well worth going through it. It's really cheap, and you have a much better sense of how to protect your own work, yet leave it for others to use by going through that training.
Hi, my name is Molly. I teach composition. So I'm just curious about the nuts and bolts of actually making this happen. So for example, if you used an existing composition textbook, for example, do you just provide students with the link? And beyond that, you mentioned about the paper interest. And I notice, students, that there's a growing interest in that. It sort of waxed a bit, and now it's sort of coming back as a thing. So what have you done for accessibility digitally as well as on paper?
If you use one of the big textbook repositories, there are two things you can do. Looking at the license and asking if you don't quite know how to interpret the license, asking someone about it. If it's free to use, you can load it right. If you have an online class, you can load that right into your class. So you don't have to provide a link. Obviously, if you use library resources, you have to provide just the link. The other thing is sending students. I don't know what the capabilities at Franklin Pierce are for having mass-produced printouts of items, but you can give the student a link to, say, Open Textbook Network, which is going to give you the option, or the student the option, of having it printed out. And they could print it out, or the college could, or the university could take.
So they could print it out locally, or they could print it out
Or print out just those pages they need. This is something for me. With my own students, I ask them not to print everything out. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Do the online OER pages or materials offer annotating options, et cetera, so that they're more accessible to students in an interactive way?
Right, and that's sort of the beauty of using one of the big textbook repositories. You could download it and then edit it, depending on what the license says. But most of them are saying, make it yours. So add study questions, add your own materials to it.
Hello, I'm new to Franklin Pierce. I just started here about a month and a half ago, but at my previous institution, I did a fair amount of work on OER. So first of all, thank you for coming here, and thank you for all the work that you're doing as a librarian in terms of promoting OER. One thing that I've never been able to get a good sense of is how OER and the campus bookstore can peacefully coexist, because I've heard that it does not have to be a mutually exclusive relationship, but can you speak to that?
There are a couple different ways that can work. First of all, the data on the textbook and OER relationship with the bookstore, most bookstores don't make that much from textbooks. That's not where they're making their big money. They're making it on T-shirts and cups and wires and things. Secondly, many, and I think more and more college bookstores will put an OER designation in the record. So if a student is buying online, it'll say, this is an OER class. And either your instructor or your professor will be giving you the resources, or here's the link to it. And then the other thing that didn't come up but is related is what you put in your own course catalog. And editing those records if your students are registering online so that they know that the course is not going to have an additional fee for resources. I can tell you those courses become very popular very quickly, and it's almost a kind of backdoor into OER, because if you have a number of sections and only one instructor is still using a traditional textbook, there's a fair amount of pressure on that person to think about OER as opposed to using the resources. And that's a mixed bag for faculty. Some faculty really object to it. But I'm thinking of it from the student's perspective. They see it and they think, hey, this one, I don't have to pay that $100 versus this course. It's the same course, but I have to pay for the textbook. So there are a number of institutional policies that, was that the case with where you were?
Institutional policies we didn't really have a true campus-wide OER policy.
Mm-hmm.
But like, for example, I know at our bookstore, when our psychology department started going more in an OER direction, they started stacking like the OpenStax Intro to Psychology textbook as one example.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really something that I worked with a great deal on the. I didn't work with them a great deal on it, and I kind of regret that. And I'm always looking for, we don't want to, put our friends in the bookstore out of business.
Right.
You know?
They're not going to be put out of it.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jim. Is this picking up? I'm curious about how one might determine whether an OER site is legitimate.
Mhm.
I'm assuming that the repositories go through all the right processes. But if you don't use a repository, how would one do the research to determine if it's validly OER?
If it looks stinky, it probably is. In other words, I mean, with this book that I used as an example, it was a business book. The provost wrote to me and he said, is this really an OER? And I looked at it. It looked like one, but one of the first things I did was go to the publisher and search the publisher's site to see if this is the same version, the same edition that the publisher is charging for. There's a good chance that's not an OER. I generally kind of try to steer people toward the repositories because the other benefit is they're reviewed by faculty. And since quality is something that we're all concerned about, that's not to say if you find something on the web that looks interesting, if you have any doubt, or if I have any doubt, what I do is I put the link in. And I teach primarily online. I don't put the resource in the course. And I say something about copyright to the students. It's a gray area, but if it's so worthwhile. But more and more, I don't find too many things that I think, oh, this is just the thing I have to absolutely use.
There's a phrase in the literature called faux ER. That you,
A FOPN,
I think you were talking. You were saying that the wash. What was the phrase?
open washing.
Open washing. Yeah, and it's true. A lot of the stuff they kind of lure you in. It looks like it's going to be OER, but then once you get into it, there are costs associated.
Right,
And
right. Math is a good example because they've been putting a lot of OER publishers out for math. But then when the student goes there, they can see the information, but if they want to use the resources, they have to pay for them. The other thing that's happening is, and this might be in your own library catalog, EBSCO has loaded the open digital access journals.
And they have a product too, like EBSCO.
Yeah,
They do have a product. Do you have any experience with that? I think,
no, that's a new, we had no money, so. And it's getting mixed reviews because I am on some listservs where other institutions are using it. But the benefit for us at Granite State was that if you searched in our catalog, you'd have access to an article that was in an open access journal, but you found it through a search engine. You could go to the open access journal site, find the same journal, and access the article, but that's like a 5-step process. For students, it was easier this way.
I'm wondering if any of the faculty in the room know of any faculty colleagues or peers who have tried OER or have been successful with it. Or another question I'll ask you is, have you considered OER? And if you haven't acted on it yet, what are the reasons why you haven't?
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for coming. I'm Zan, and I coordinate the writing program here. And so we, like most universities, have, most of the students take a composition sequence of classes. And trying to keep that, trying to find a resource that works for just the 3 to 4 full-time and like 10 to 12 adjunct instructors is challenging. And then finding time to figure out, so is there anything for composition that would work for us? We have also worked with a publisher to put together student-written pieces and then instructor pieces, which is a lot less, and instructor assignments that produce those pieces. So I suppose my biggest stumbling block is the time to really investigate it.
And it's a very legitimate one.
Yeah. So, but I think I have some clues as to where to start now. So, yeah. And what would be my first step, I guess, as a composition instructor? Thinking about like if I wanted consistency across sections.
This is one of the things I was doing with faculty in my last position. I would ask them for their syllabus, and then I would put together a list of sites that kind of matched their learning objectives for the course or for the individual individual sections of the course, and give them several alternatives to think about. And then we'd kind of go from there. And I would tell you, each syllabus took probably 40 hours of my work
Wow.
to
And
just
yeah.
do that, because I would try to be very my guess is the faculty member who knew exactly what they wanted, it wouldn't take them that much time,
Yeah, right. Okay.
but it could.
But it could.
Particularly in something like composition,
Yeah.
where you may find, I was working with someone on composition, and we did find some open textbooks, but none of them were quite what she wanted.
Yeah.
And so she wound up putting together her own.
Her own. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
It looks a lot like old course packets sometimes, doesn't it? Yes.
My question, if I explain to you what I like about using a textbook from a publishing company, and then maybe you could tell me if that's available this way. So a textbook that also has instructor resources that are robust, that have, you know, and that are also that can be connected to Canvas, as well as a student's resource site, and in a field that is constantly changing, so that I trust the textbook to be updated. So how can
Well, if you're using an open textbook, your class, there's someone who I know who's written a media textbook, and he has video in it, and you know, study aids and pieces from other OER, but he's been working on it for 2 years, and he keeps updating it all the time because, as you know, these things change. The topics I talk about in digital democracy 5 years ago are not the topics I'm talking about today. I think if you're going to use an OER textbook and kind of want to keep it up to date, there is a lot online that's kept up to date, and you'll see sort of if you go into the Open Textbook Network, the revisions and who's revised it or who's updated it. So that is happening in these repositories. But you personally, it would be like you doing your course and just going through your resources every time you teach the course and either updating them or switching them out, re-looking, researching for resources. There's no easy answer to that one, because particularly in media studies, because it's so dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest stumbling block, as Pat pointed out, is I think we're all sort of on board in an ideal world, but it's where do you find the time to locate the resources or create your own with all the other demands. But, you know, it is happening. On the other hand, people are finding time, or maybe it's a great opportunity for collaboration, where a department might farm out different parts of a discipline to create something together.
I know a group in healthcare who are doing that. That's 5 faculty members, and they each have taken an individual piece of the healthcare program, and they're working on that piece.
At Granite State?
Yeah, yeah.
So I've used OER. It does work very well in classes where you rely on text that are in the public domain, like classics. So when I've done political philosophy, no books.
Everything, yeah.
Right? Because Plato, there's lots of folks that put Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, Hobbes online, and that's all I use. So it's easy in those kind of areas. A lot of humanities courses in literature, some older historical text.
Right.
You know, if you're teaching Moby Dick, that's for.
It's all over the place.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I know, of course, there's versions of these things that you can pay for that are annotated and have interactive elements like that. But so I find it easiest then. What I do though, when it's not a class like that, is that I haven't had the students buy anything in the bookstore for about the last 12 years. Nothing. I use our libraries, academic. It's not, like you said, it's the level below. It's not OER because they're paying for it, but at least
Right.
I'm making use of what they pay for. And there are some subscriptions that we have as an institution, so I have them use that. And political science, that might be a little easier because of how much lends itself to current events. So at that level, at least I try to avoid the textbooks, because Intro to U.S. Government 22nd edition by such and such a company with an update for the latest congressional elections is just, you know,
You can find
right.
free resources. Yeah,
You know,
right,
but,
right.
So that's about what I do as far as OER, and then maybe moving a little bit away from that. But yeah, I think it's important. I think when you mention things like faculty creating these healthcare modules, and what universities or colleges need to do is, I'm wondering what their incentives are to do it. I know that one of them is the intangible one where they just want people to learn, they want to spread knowledge, but it's a shame that we can't find more of like a material incentive structure, maybe tied to promotion or tenure.
The OER community
Yeah.
has a whole committee devoted to producing publications and marketing pieces for institutions because of this. You know, I'm coming from the university system in New Hampshire. The legislature has been very, very vocal about our use of OER and moving all 4 campuses towards using OER. But what's driving it are the cost of higher ed and the pressures that the government is putting on institutions of higher education to lower the costs. And the other one is retention and enrollment. That I sometimes think that those are the 2 that are really driving it.
Okay.
From my experience at Dartmouth, something else was dry. It's not really caught on at Dartmouth much.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I teach kinesiology and assessment and prescription of fitness. Actually, kinesiology, if I look at it from an OER perspective, I'm finding units or modules, but not something that would go through an entire semester. So I'm feeling like some of the more specific aspects to those classes just aren't yet found as so easily on OER. But I'm looking forward to looking at some of your resources. Do you have any that you think might fit more in the science perspective of trying to find OER resources?
I could probably send you a list because of the work that I did last summer with the healthcare
Okay.
and some science related to that. Off the top of my head, I know there are some sites. Every week I'm on a listserv that institutions from all over the country, and particularly Canada, are advertising. Either someone will write in and say, do you have a textbook for X that's OER? Because these are hard to find. And I've been constantly amazed that 10 institutions will write back and say, we got it, we just put it up, we just made it available. Oftentimes they're not submitting them to the repository necessarily. Eventually it will get there, but it's sort of a moving target.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that that listserv, I'm going to scribble that down to join OER listserv.
Yes.
But
There's a lot of ranting on it too, but
yeah, well, that's true of every listserv.
Quality, the editorial control in these repositories, who's reviewing?
well, think about when you submit a paper for publication. This is the pre-publication step. So it's before it's been sent to the publisher, but it's gone through peer review already. I will not say that every single thing in there has. But the institutional repositories, that's been mandated. At UNH, it's now mandated. At Dartmouth, it's mandated that you write an article, you get it published. Before it gets published, you deposit a copy in the repository.
And yeah, we've talked in very, very general terms about an institutional repository here, and it's just, I was basically told that we have higher priorities at this point. I think everybody's in favor of an institutional repository,
Everybody.
but the costs and the maintenance of it and the administration of it, it's just not in the cards for Franklin Pierce right now. But there are some possible other approaches where we could do kind of like a faux institutional repository, like by putting things up on our some of our archives pages and things like that. But
And I think we're all learning too, because initially the things that were being put in even like the Open Textbook Network weren't being necessarily reviewed. Actually, not so much Open Textbook Network, but OER Commons. People were just putting their work there. It wasn't being proofread. And it got kind of ugly for a while, but that's not the case anymore.
On that, I would just imagine that with the pressure, maybe even from legislation to reduce costs to students, that this would create a higher demand for content within the repositories for OER, and which would create a system where you have more content and to meet that demand as well as accessibility. Are you seeing that
Yes.
trend?
Open Georgia, Open Oregon, California, they've all mandated. The University of Hawaii, Hawaii tried to legislate it and the faculty rebelled. So these other states have kind of learned from that experience, but they have said at these institutions where, like Open Oregon, which is a wonderful project, the legislature has given them money to do it. And that money eventually flows down to the faculty through faculty grants.
are you finding on campuses, Pat, that like an OER committee or some sort of group is forming that addresses these issues locally for that particular campus? Or how are institutions approaching trying to grow OER on their campuses?
The ones that like Open Oregon, Open Georgia, they do. They have a state committee that kind of then each campus has their own committee, and it's made up of faculty and usually librarians, and they have a pool of money. The other thing that I'm seeing is an OER librarian to work with faculty, because copyright, for one thing, is not usually the most interesting thing to most faculty. And that and scholarly publication librarians. I see this very much as where the projects that have been really, really good and strong have been collaborations between librarians and faculty. We're kind of working together on this. New Hampshire has taken kind of a different approach, and I'm not sure that it's, I don't know what UNH is doing. I know what Keene is doing because they've been very active and talking about what they're doing on campus, but they actually have someone who there's an OER certification program, and I went through it with one of the librarians in Keene, and she has now kind of become the de facto OER librarian and works across campus with faculty in helping them either identify resources or then develop resources. And that's worked really well, I think.
Does anybody else have any other questions? We're starting to wind down in our time, but we still do have some time for other questions or observations. I was wondering, since we have two CAE people here, if you guys had any observations or questions in how you work with students, or if students are asking, like, hey, why doesn't Pierce have more OER stuff, or do they even know it exists? So I'm going to sort of put you on the spot here a little bit.
I don't know if I can speak too directly to OER.
You can get out of the lights for a while.
But a couple things that I do see is I work with students who admit to me that they're just not doing the reading. So some of my really useful meetings with students is if they're taking an English literature class, just showing them, like, did you know that every Jane Austen book ever you can just get
Yeah.
in places.
So is it a financial thing that why they're not?
It's a financial thing, and sometimes they wait to see if they really need it. Some of it I don't understand why they don't get the books, but a lot of the time it's financial. Sometimes it's motivation. Sometimes it's kind of lack of understanding of academic culture. So they're just figuring out how to go to college. So they haven't quite figured out that they need the books yet.
Yeah.
One thing that I think might be useful for people to know is that I've had an increasing number of students say, oh, I just listened to it on YouTube. So I'm like, I feel so bad for the author and the publisher when I hear that the students are like, no, I don't have to look for that audiobook in the library. I can just listen to illegal copies. They don't even know it's illegal. They're just like, it's on YouTube. So that's what I've observed in the CAE.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. Do you find that students are do you find that audiobooks are a way that students are increasingly accessing the texts they need, or is it?
Somewhat, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up, Tracy. So when you say they find it on YouTube, are you saying that they're finding something comparable on YouTube, or that they're finding the exact source on YouTube?
They're finding, to my understanding, they're finding an illegal copy of it in segments on YouTube. I asked a student, well, how would you go about doing that? And I don't ask them too many questions, because if they're doing something illegal, I'm not going to try to stop them. That if, I just don't want to know in most cases. But a student told me the other day, she said, just look for chapter 1 of My Sister the Serial Killer on YouTube, and you'll find the audiobook.
Because somebody has just gone out and done that. Obviously not the author, but somebody has just read it aloud and posted it on a YouTube channel, knowing that it will help fellow students. And of course it's illegal, or in most cases.
Maybe uploaded illegal copies of it from the real audiobook.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, there's always a workaround, right? I guess they're industrious and clever when it comes to finding a way to not do exactly what we want them to do. Okay.
Do it legally.
Yeah, well, and I will point out, some of you, I didn't send this to all of you in email, but to the members of the cohort, I did send Pat's PowerPoint slides and her Word file with all the appropriate links that she referred to. But Jim and others, if you send me an email, I'll make sure that you have all those resources too, because Pat referred to a lot of them in her presentation. I mean, a good starting point is just going to the OpenStax website and start looking around there, because it's divided into disciplines. And so we had some questions about communication or composition books, and that's a place to start at least. But I mean, that's not the only source, but that's one of the major ones.
Yeah, Open Textbook Network from the University of Minnesota. I find more things there than OpenStax, but that may be what I'm looking,
Well, no, I mean, you know more about it than I do, so.
And Saylor University, the Saylor.org portion, has a lot of resources too. Yeah. They're out there. There's pockets of them everywhere.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming, Pat.
Oh,
I think
thank
we've all
you.
learned a lot, and we've all got a lot to think about as we move forward and trying to get OER a bigger presence here on campus. So thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Thank you.